Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast starts right now.
Hello and welcome to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, your official podcast of the New Orleans Pelicans. It's been a bit, well, actually, no, we talked to you last week, but now it is the off-season set of podcasts. We got something special in store for you, which we started yesterday, player profiles. We're going to kind of delve into specifically on some of the players. We'll still talk, the playoffs that are going on right now with Jim Eichenhofer, Pelicans.com. Jim, for people that maybe, shame on you, didn't catch the one yesterday, what are we doing right now here in the offseason with these player profiles?
Yes, we're going to go through the 11 players on the Pelicans that played at least 1,000 minutes during the regular season. So all the way through, really the guys that were in the rotation consistently. Jordan Hawkins will be the 11th of that group as the player that played the 11th most minutes. But this week we're starting with the 5 guys that were in the starting lineup for the vast majority of the year. Started with Zion yesterday, continuing with Brandon Ingram today on Tuesday.
All right, easy enough to do that. David Wesley is going to specifically touch on BI. We're doing that with a couple of different people. Antonio Daniel started things off with Zion. You can always go back and listen to those as well. And I'm interested as we go through the roster. We have someone specifically touching on people. There's a member of the broadcast that said, I'm not doing it unless I get this player. And it's going to be interesting to get JD's take. That's the only tease I'm going to give out there here as well. But we'll do that. So let's get right into it. David Wesley of Bally Sports New Orleans to break down Brandon Ingram's season.
Glad you thought of that. Glad you thought of that now.
I hear you. All right, welcome. Here we go. 3, 2, and 1. Time now to bring in our guest, and it is Mr. David Wesley, analyst for Bally Sports New Orleans. David, first off, it is great seeing you. I wish we could be talking about second round of the playoffs for the Pelicans here and things of that nature. And I guess that's how we've sort of felt here for about a week and a half of we wish we could be still playing basketball. We want to go back and look and see how that season is. How do you look back at the 2023-2024 season and explain it to Pels fans or I guess highlight some of the things about it?
Well, I think it was a good season. I think it was probably the healthiest season that I've been a part of since I've been here since 2012. Zion played a career-high games this year. They won 49 games. They should have won probably 54 or 55 games. It was such a disappointing end to the season with the 5 home games before the end of the season, and then the way they finished getting swept by OKC. That's disappointing, and that's the taste that's left in everyone's mouth. But if you look back at the season, I feel like it was a really good season, best road record in the league. And I think with health, this team could have advanced a lot further.
I got to ask it. It's the standard question. Sorry, Jim, that I've asked everybody so far because I'd love to know if you have any idea. And I got a pen and a piece of paper ready to go. Best road record in the NBA, like you just said, 11 of the last 13 at home. He didn't win. What was the big difference in your mind between on the road and at home? I mean, I think they'd be happy to see you when you're at home games.
Me and Antonio Daniels had this conversation just completely. And there's really no explanation for it. I mean, I've been on teams where we were a better road team than home teams, statistically wise. We weren't losing like the Pelicans lost at home this year, but we shot it better. We played better on the road. Why is that? I have no idea. We talked a lot about should they be shooting around in the arena more, maybe practicing in the arena more. But it's not something you can really put your finger on it. And especially when it comes to role players tend to play better at home. And this was the very opposite. For a young team to play better on the road is kind of weird.
David, obviously we're going to get into some specifics about Brandon Ingram, and we've already kind of touched a little bit on kind of the peaks and valleys and the highs and lows of the season for the team overall. It seemed like it was kind of that way for Brandon Ingram as well in terms of there were a lot of good things, and then obviously the end of the season was rough. But I mean, I guess we could start with some of the positive stuff that he did this year. I mean, how did you look at his season in terms of some of the better developments? I mean, for example, he played in 63 of the first 70 games of the season. Obviously, they won more games than they had the entire time he had been here. What are some of the things that you look back on and say these are some of the positives that you take away from his year?
Well, I thought he scored the basketball like he's done since he came in the league, and I think he passed the ball better than he has in the league. And I think he ran the team. You felt like even though he's a quiet guy, that there was some quiet leadership there. He was playing at a high level. Like you said, at 63 games of the first 70, that's outstanding. And, looking at the new rule, there's an uptick across the league of players that haven't played their 65 or so games. Now we want to make that big money. We went out and played it. So that includes Zion, who played, his career high games. And I think that's really important. I like the way BI played. Again, the lasting taste in our mouth is kind of a fizzle down the end of the season. I don't look at those small moments where he didn't play well and think, oh, there's something wrong. We need to do something about Brandon Ingram. I think he's going to come back stronger, better, and I think this team is going to come back with a vengeance.
He talked a lot about in the exit interview, as well as the press conference that he did right after the Game 4 loss to Oklahoma City, about things that he can do differently and maybe things that he needs to change to, be more effective and maybe more specifically to the point, figure out how to help the coaches in terms of what they want to do as a team. I mean, I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you as a former player too is how difficult is it? I mean, he's 8 years into his career. How tough is it for guys from either your career or guys that you played with to this far into the career to say, okay, I'm going to change the way I play, when obviously I've made a ton of money and I've been very successful doing things a certain way, and now it's time to kind of tweak things or change things and go a different direction?
So the great players, the really good players, the players that play many years in this league, for my generation, the money wasn't astronomical like it is now. But you often heard players talk about, I added this to my game. I did this summer. I got in better shape. I ate better, changed my diet, all those things. And I think that is important going forward. But for Brandon Ingram, his leadership has to be more consistent. His style of play has to be more consistent. I think some nights he kind of walked into games, but when he played with pace in his movements and in the half court, that pace is how he gets guys off of him. He's not a big guy. He's not throwing guys around. So his pace matters more than, maybe a bigger guy who can, that uses his body to get people off of him. Brandon Ingram doesn't do that. He uses his length and his space to kind of create and do what he does. Therefore, his consistent pace, you watch a guy like Steph Curry constantly running, he cuts and always moving. Somewhere close to that style is where I think he's going to make another jump, is just being more consistent. I thought the reason why this team kind of ebbed and flowed was their consistency. And, young teams, they struggle with things like that. And the more consistent they can get, I think the better they will, the record will be better and the finish will be better.
And David, you just quickly touched on leadership there. And I thought that was something that really stood out with BI, not only right after the game in the series loss, but also the following day in exit interviews there as well, of, looking at himself, looking in the mirror, and what are the things you need to kind of build on and stuff. And I guess that's a perspective that I wanted to ask you as a former player. How much of that is important? How much of that can you work on in an off season when he says, hey, whether it's communication with other players, communication with the coaching staff, and in aspects of the game and that, but it really seemed like he wanted to get back to work here in about 2-3 weeks here. And I thought if you could kind of harp on what stood out to you, the fact that he said communication several times with Zion, communication several times with the coaching staff. What does that mean to us?
Well, first of all, you want to be on the same page. You want to have conversations that where do you like the ball? What's going to get you better shots? What's going to get you open? What's going to get people off of Brandon Ingram to where he can kind of flow and do what he does? I think his leadership and communication, the communication part. So my last year in the NBA, I played with Cleveland and I played with LeBron. And when you watched him communicate, he knew everything. He communicated with the coaches. He changed game plans in shoot around. The coaches come in, they say, hey, we're going to do this, this, and this. And he would look across and go, well, if y'all did that to me, I would just X, Y, Z. And we would change whole schemes based on a guy we're playing. So that's where you start going. And that's when things really matter to players on the court. They're taking ownership, which is big. They're being a part of the collection. I mean, I don't think there's a coach in this league that doesn't look to his players and want input because they're out there on the court. They know what they're seeing. And especially the better the player, I mean, there's not a lot of Hall of Fame players that coach. So
right.
How do you know how to coach or what's going on with your star player unless he's communicating, hey, this is what I need, this is what I want. And therefore, I think the more he can do that, communicate with players, communicate with coaches, I think the team will get better.
David, you mentioned kind of the balance of how you look at when you look back at a season when you're a player like Brandon Ingram and you have the 82 games or the 64 that he played in during the regular season, and then you have the 4 in the playoffs, which obviously were extremely disappointing and something that he said was really tough. I actually did a little David Wesley research, and I looked back at your career because I thought, okay, maybe I'll find an instance where you had like a really good regular season and then you struggle in the playoffs. But to your credit, I really didn't find a whole lot. He's pumping his fist for people that listen on the podcast. But I thought, I mean, really, it seemed like at least statistically, the only playoffs that you didn't shoot well was 03-04 with New Orleans. And obviously, I'm just going by stats. That was the year that you guys played Miami in the first round. D Wade was a rookie that year. Yeah. So, but I say all that to ask the question. I mean, how much do you spend time in the summer dwelling on or thinking about, like, even if it's the team, not even just individually, that you had like a really good regular season, but then in the playoffs you struggled? Is it the kind of thing where if you're him, you kind of have to just push it aside and just be like, that wasn't a representation of me as a player. That's something that is just kind of an outlier of what I did over the course of the season?
Well, for Brandon Ingram, and I think, even for me, sometimes it's hard to talk about the mindset and how stars kind of go about their business. Why some stars, like James Harden, great regular seasons and not very much in the postseason. Why is that? For me, I'm one of the others. I'm a role player. I'm getting what my star is creating for me. Now, I wasn't just a standstill shooter, so I had my own creation, but we played through, Ashburn and Baron Davis, and they did most of the cooking. So, and for BI to have such a disappointing postseason, was he injured? Was he not feeling his best? I've been waiting on to hear, like, and especially when you have lower extremity injuries, trusting whatever it is, a knee, a foot, a toe, or whatever, sometimes it takes time. And he didn't have a whole lot of time before the playoffs, and he's out there trying to give it. And then he's playing one of the most physical defenders, period. And for me, when the season was over, for me to play, for me to start, for me to be a part of a team, I had to work in the summer. I had to get going. I had to start my first probably 7 years. As soon as the season was over, I was back hooping. I had to stop that because I was getting older and I wanted to save some of my tread for later. But that's what I had to do. And I think in the 03-04 season, or the 02-03, is that the season you were talking about?
No, 03-04 was the year where was really one of the only playoff seasons where your shooting was down, where you didn't shoot threes well. That was against the Heat.
Yeah, I kind of remember that. I kind of remember that series, and I don't know if I was injured or wheeling around, but I think it's you see stars out there. They're going out there. They're going ham. Anthony Edwards is going ham. Can Bi go ham? I believe he can. I believe he will. I just can't speak to what's going on with his body. Mm-hmm. He does sound like he has the right mindset, and he wants to get back in the gym and get it going, and that's a positive sign.
One of the things David, I do. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the recent episodes, the one we did last week, I said the same thing in terms of I wonder a lot about his physical status in that series, just because I felt like he did a bunch of things that he did there was a few specific plays that didn't look like what I'd seen from him all season. For example, there was a fast break where they passed ahead to him on the right wing. He had one guy in front of him between him and the basket, and he just veered away. I think he passed the ball across the court, and I was like, that does not look like him at 100%. So
yeah, he wasn't in attack mode.
Right, exactly. But last thing I was going to ask you from this, I mean, were you surprised? What was your reaction to his comments after the season in terms of specifically he said, this is the worst I've felt like I've been in a Pelicans uniform? I mean, for me, I was surprised at how just blunt he was. You just don't hear a lot of players speak that way after the season. But, I mean, maybe it's a good thing that he, was just willing to kind of look at everything and just kind of take an honest appraisal of how things went.
Jim, that's leadership. He's saying, I got to be better. And we all know that. We're all saying it. In my post-game or pre-game, Brandon Ingram has to be better. He has to do more. I've said it many times. And for him to look himself in the mirror, a lot of guys don't want to do that, and say, I have to be better for this team. I have to be better. I can't play like that if we're expected to win. I'm encouraged. I can't wait to see what he goes in the lab and comes up with, because that's what the really, Kobe's and they went in the summer, added something, made their bodies better, came back with better focus. And if he does that, I can't wait to see what it looks like.
I want to end, David, on what Jim just said and piggyback on this, because I think, it is easy to look at what's recent and kind of feel like what that player is and what he's done. There's two things, though, that really stood out to me this year that kind of maybe speak to the player and the person and player and leader, I guess it is. He led the team in assists, right? He also played his best season, I think, defensively. And up until really he got injured, I think the conversation was, this is probably the best season overall, the best Brandon Ingram has had. So it's very interesting how in a month's time, it went from that's the best season to him saying this is the worst in the Pelican uniform. So I'm curious to go back to communication, right? Is that, hey, I did what the team needed me to do, but do we all want Brandon Ingram to be the leader and assist, right? I mean, that's a whole different conversation of this. Does this team need a point guard and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Defense, you asked him to be more defensive oriented. He played much better defensively this year than any other season. So is that part of that communication? But does it also leave a positive note for fans here to be like, look, this guy can change his game. This guy did what the team needed him to do in those two areas. That's the best I've seen Brandon Ingram, which, gives me reason to believe if there is communication and he works on certain aspects of his games, this guy can still be a great player.
Absolutely. And when you have your best players committed like that on the defensive end of the ball, and I think we can all say that Zion showed way more signs of defensive intensity, being in the right places, getting in a stance, guarding the man one-on-one as opposed to blow-bys. When those two guys put that onus on themselves, the rest of the guys will fall in line. I think that's why they were a good defensive team. If they can continue to add that and make that a priority, I think they're going to be a much better team. And I love the fact that Brandon Ingram himself is putting that on himself. Yes, he has to score the ball, but you look around the league. I mean, I go back to Anthony Edwards. He ain't just playing one end of the floor. So stars are being asked to do more. Bi can see the writing on the wall. He's engaged. He's ready to go. I think fans should be excited about it. I'm looking forward to next season. I said 2 seasons ago they were a top 4 team. I said this year they were a top 4 team, and there's no reason why they're not a top 4 team next season as well.
No doubt. David, I lied to you. I do want to close out with we're talking about players looking in the offseason. Jim's very curious on this. He's going to do a 15-page article on this. How do you get better in the offseason? Did you look at a camera wrongly? Different suits? Do you want pocket coats that are a little different? Do we break down film differently? How do you get better in the offseason for the upcoming year? That's what we all want to know, really.
Usually I buy new suits every year. So, and then hopefully the rest just comes out the way it's supposed to, and I don't say anything stupid to get me fired.
Okay. Well, that's a very good thing to do, right? That's literally what I try to do every single day on my talk show. David, always a pleasure, man. Thank you for giving us a little bit of his time. And now the off season, but very soon, man, it'll be the new season.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, and I can't wait to see what these guys come back with.
Thank you so much, man.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, guys. All right. You guys have a good one.
All right. Thanks to David Wesley from Bally Sports New Orleans, giving his thoughts on BI there as well. I think, Jim, as you heard me kind of close up with him, it's one of the things that is very interesting that before that injury, everyone thought BI was having probably his best season as an overall basketball player. And to hear him, as you brought out, a very aware and introspective 17-minute post-game press conference where he was very blunt, very honest with himself, and almost too kind of surprising to us, right? To say that it was his worst year as a Pelican, though in the two areas unequivocally the best that we've seen him as a Pelican in terms of being assist leader, playing on the defensive side of the ball. So I don't know what to take from that other than I think you're seeing even at this age and this many years of the league, he can still work on his game and refine it. But I keep going back to him being very specific. What will it take for the Pels to move forward? And he said communication. And that's something that's going to be very interesting to me. And then see what he does, as David said, when he gets in the lab.
Yeah, I was definitely surprised by that. I'm not sure if how much of the fact that he stressed communication as one of the things that he needs to improve, how much of that is based on that he's just a generally kind of quiet guy. You know, he doesn't really talk a lot. I'm sure he's a lot different around his teammates than he is around us in the media and what he does in interviews. But I do think that, you know, and David touched on this a little bit of just being more vocal and being more, you know, sharing more input. I thought the story that he gave about LeBron was really interesting about how he was that involved in everything and all of the details and all the specifics that he could go as far as saying, like, to the coaches, this isn't what we're going to do. We need to do something else because it's not going to work. So stuff like that, I think it'll be interesting to see if Brandon kind of tries to take on more of that role. But, you know, you mentioned earlier about specific media people as guests for specific players. One of the reasons I wanted to get David for Brandon Ingram was just because I wanted to get his perspective on a player that's in the league for 8 years, needs to make some tweaks and some changes to how he approaches things. And David has so much experience. He was in the playoffs a million times. Really, I think as much as any player on the Pelicans roster, except for CJ. I mean, David had more playoff experience than anybody on this squad. So love listening to his insight and curious to see how BI is going to, you know, change things this offseason and how he's going to look coming back. But I mean, I guess one other final thought I had about the way that Brandon reacted to the season too was, I mean, I guess we'll never know, but I would have been so interested to hear what his perspective would have been and how much different things would have been if it wasn't for that playoff series and just the way that the season ended. It was really tough, but kind of emblematic of the way the season went for the Pelicans overall.
Yeah, I think we talked about it last week when we finished our radio roundtable. The things that plagued New Orleans during the season, they don't tend to get better during the playoffs. I think the reasons that caused losses during the playoffs were the reasons that caused losses during the regular season. So from at least that perspective, it's pretty easy to circle as to certain things, you know, the turnovers and the consistency in three-point shooting, things like that, even though they were one of the best teams in the three-point shooting. The point is, they're real, as David Griffin said, there's a really clear picture as to what needs to happen. And I think that's a good thing because you've had several seasons where, well, do we do this? Do we do that? I think you can at least see this works, that worked, that maybe works, this doesn't work. So you can look at it from that perspective. Now, what is working is a couple of teams have moved on into the Western Conference playoffs. Great series between Minnesota and Denver going on right now. Dallas and the Thunder, that starts tonight, Jim, on this Tuesday. So how do you view this one?
I'm so fascinated and interested to see how the Thunder do. I mean, I think everyone that watched the Thunder versus the Pelicans playoff series is curious to see them against a Mavericks team that was one of the best teams in the NBA over the last couple months of the season, has turned into a really good defensive team after that was a problem for them. And also, the Thunder, with how are they going to defend Luka and Kyrie, but also what are the Mavericks going to do against Shea and some of the other players? We saw what Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren were capable of in the playoffs as well. So I can't wait to watch the series, just because I feel like it's going to be so interesting to see OKC in the second round with not that much playoff experience, but so much talent, to see how much they can carry that through. And I mean, to some extent, I don't want to get too carried away with this, but how the Thunder looks, and how does that change, or maybe it doesn't at all, the way that we look back at the first round series that the Pelicans played against them.
Yeah, no doubt. Let's see what takes place on that. Coming up the rest of the week, Jim, what do we have tomorrow on the New Orleans Pelicans podcast?
Yes, we're going to have CJ McCollum will be Wednesday. Herb Jones will be Thursday. Jonas Valanciunas Friday. And CJ McCollum, we're going to have Will Guillory as our guest for that one.
All right, should be fun. See you then. Don't forget, you can always tune in on the New Orleans Pelicans podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. If you happen to miss one, you can always go back. That's the beauty of where you get your podcasts, and go check them out. Jim, as always, man, appreciate the time.
Thanks, Gus.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcasts. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans podcast.